Tim Tollefson, welcome to the Single Track Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Finn. Suddenly your voice got a lot clearer and more focused as soon as you hit record.
It's we're going for the NPR vibe here at Single Track. But hey, I feel like it's been kind of a long time coming because we have a lot of mutual connections. I'm based here in Salt Lake City, and at least 75% of this famous Chico State trail running convert tribe lives out here. I know Jimmy Elam and Anthony Costales, and one day we're going to get the famous Brent Handa out onto the trails, but it's good to meet you too.
Yeah, I'm a little sad that they all migrated east and didn't stay in Mammoth, but it's understandable. That it's cool to see all those guys still crushing. And a fun fact, Brent, he actually officiated my wedding wearing toe shoes, which was hilarious because I've always made fun of those.
Another fun fact, he is the creator of the logo for this show. He's not just a legendary runner, an extremely talented graphic artist as well. And apparently he does weddings. So what can that man not do? In Vibrams.
Yep.
We have a lot to talk about today. I've been waiting to have this conversation for a while. I think the first thing to go over is the fact that you now have a new gig on the running scene. You're not just a pro athlete, you're a race director. So talk about this new event that's happening in Mammoth soon.
Yeah, so this is really exciting. So we're launching the Mammoth Trail Fest this September 22nd through the 25th. And it's going to be a series multiple day festival oriented around just community, badass trail running, get some inspiring people in our sport to, talk or show films, really just trying to create a platform for more people to access our incredible sport. And it's been something that's been incubating for probably since 2015, almost 2016, after my first UTMB experience. And I just realized that, we have some amazing events here stateside, especially like the Rut. I think what Mike has done is incredible. And at that time, I wasn't familiar with the Rut. I was new to the sport. So I was more introduced to big events through UTMB. And then I realized, wow, there's kind of this absence domestically in the States for that. And then, obviously with respect to the Rut and Broken Arrow, and now there are some amazing events coming up, but it was kind of this mission of, I think we should cultivate and have more of these things stateside. And then just over the last 7 years, I've had a lot of opportunities to travel the globe and experience a lot of events, big, small, through, amazing terrain. And I really just wanted to be able to piece that together and take my favorite components and create something in California. A lot of people can't travel the way maybe some of us elites or people, they have one bucket list, and it's a huge financial burden and barrier to get to some of these events. So my hope is that in California, right here in the smack center of the Eastern Sierra, that we can provide that platform for people to come and have these, mass European style experiences, but, in California, in the Golden State. So I'm pretty excited about it.
And this will be a festival format, so multi-day?
Yep. So right now we're going to do 3 days of 3 separate races. The first day will be our shorter kind of intro event, 26K. Then Saturday, that's Friday. Saturday we'll do the 50K, and then Sunday will be a hill climb. And we're going to have a presentation and award ceremony on the top of the summit at 11,053 feet following that, the hill climb. So a little different than maybe some of the traditional stuff. But and then we've toyed around with the idea of multiple different race distances. I have permits for much longer races. But for me, I really dig the sub ultra, and I think that to really reach a wide audience domestically, I want to start to include more of that to get people excited. And then if they want to do longer stuff, they can always look at other options that are already established. But that's not to say we won't have long races eventually. But this year we're really going to focus more on kind of that middle ground. And personally, 50K is my favorite distance. I feel like that's the threshold where you can still hammer and race true racing, where it's every second counts. And then you get to 50 mile and beyond. It's kind of what you can do in a race shifts. It's much more about enduring than just like pedal to the metal. So
I want to talk in a minute about sub ultras as a gateway to growing the sport, like how it's easier than maybe just saying, hey, ultra running, it's 100K, 100-mile distances, that's it. But I was talking with Mike Foote on a separate episode earlier because you mentioned he does the rut. And I do love this festival format because we have so few opportunities as a community to come together for more than like a day. And it happens like once or twice a year. And if we can stretch that out to like 3 or 4 days at once, I think it grows deeper roots in the community. And it just, in addition to the race, there's more opportunities just to like convene and be friends and all that kind of stuff. So huge kudos on that format.
For sure. Thanks. Yeah. And I mean, those have been my best experiences. Like, obviously, like everybody, I've had some terrible races and I've had some good races. And on the terrible races, especially, if you just show up and then leave, it's kind of a really sad experience, so if you can celebrate other people a little bit longer or just, hang out with the community, I think it's really special. And this year, a lot of my closest friends in the sport, elite athletes or media space based people, they're all committed to coming out and just kind of enjoying. So I think it'll be a great venue just to hopefully like plant some of those seeds and nurture like deeper connections throughout our entire sport, like front to back of the pack.
You mentioned that UTMB and the Euro scene was a fairly big inspiration for the race, and that there's other festival-type formats here in the U.S., like Broken Arrow and the Rut. Are there any other particular features of this new Mammoth series that you're excited about, or maybe you're toying with implementing that aren't quite there yet?
So I think a really neat thing about our event is that anyone that's been to Mammoth, they know that it's like a quintessential small mountain town. We're probably 4 square miles across. You can walk to everything. The community is like, we're a huge tourist-based community. So the locals, we need tourism to survive. And so basically every domain of our community is excited about doing this, from our tourism board to the chamber, to the hospital, to the ski area, to local businesses. I just think it's going to be that feeling of when you come in, it's almost like you're entering this, kind of like that Chamonix style venue where it just feels a little more intimate versus being spread out, or it's like, oh, we have to drive. I love a lot of the ski area events that happen in the States, but some of them kind of, it's like, oh, you have to drive up to the ski area and then you're kind of removed a little bit, and it just feels fragmented. And I know that's logistically just how our infrastructure is designed in the States in a lot of ways, but Mammoth is a much, more closely knit geographical and I'd say, just from an infrastructure standpoint. So I think we're going to be able to offer something pretty unique. And then something that, we could talk about eventually, but I really want to lean into like the storytelling aspect and like the live coverage and that stuff. And obviously year one, we're going to be limited in terms of resources, bandwidth, and personnel. But that is the big term vision, is connecting and being able to tell these stories. Because I think, that's where it's really going to bring more people into the fold, and we're going to have a greater reach and hopefully be able to scale a bit better. So.
This is a somewhat technical question, and I'll preface it by saying there's a ton of areas around the country, especially in the Eastern Sierra, but also in places like Northern New England, where there's other great mountain ranges where I'd love to see races happen, but permitting is a huge issue. And I'm curious, in your case, when you were selling this race and getting permits and stuff like that, did you pitch the economic benefits to the community as one of the reasons why this should go through?
I didn't lead with that, but it did come up.
Okay.
And from my experience working with the Forest Service, because that's our biggest permitting agency, the U.S. Forest Service, because most of our courses are on their land, we really, through my relationships with them, and I'd say that's the biggest thing. You have to build a relationship with them, it was a challenge, and it's because their department is stretched so thin. The idea of having another event that they're going to permit it's not that they're not interested. It's just they have limited resources, and they take a percentage of overall profits or proceeds. But it's still not going to be a big money making operation for them. So it's kind of, there's not a huge incentive, and their job is to mitigate all trail users. So if you're permitting like a medium or a large scale event, they have to be thoughtful to all the other user groups out there on the same day. Like and in the U.S., we cannot close trails, and I don't think we ever should. We need to be thoughtful to all the other users, but they have to kind of take a big picture. So even if it's like, hey, we could drive X amount of thousands of people to our area, they're still thinking about the environmental impact, the impact on other trail user groups. It's not going to be an economic decision for them in terms of, this could stimulate our economy. And I understand that. But it was a big challenge to get courses approved. And that took several years, actually, to get the ones I wanted. And then I also have to remind myself, like, what we settled on are amazing courses, but like I wanted so much more, and I kept being told no. And I have to kind of remind myself that people won't know what they don't know. They're still going to have an amazing experience. This is an awesome course. This is a loop course, or all of them are. But like being someone that's been in an area for such a long time, you're like, oh, but this one turn would have been awesome because you get this vantage point, or I love that little rocky descent. And there's so many of those little things that you wouldn't even notice in a race. I have to just kind of continually remind myself, no, these are still awesome courses. And you're not always going to get what you want. And especially if you look at Mammoth, the location, we are landlocked by basically wilderness areas around every corner of our community. So like these courses go up and teeter on the edge of all the non-wilderness boundaries, and then like we encompass basically every usable trail we can in kind of a thoughtful, non-contrived way.
Would you ever consider affiliating this festival with larger race circuits, for example, Solomon Golden Trail Series, or if you introduce these, like, for example, like a 100K event, the Golden Ticket Series?
I'm not opposed to it. I've had conversations with actually a lot of different entities over the last few years, and have realized that there's a big appetite for something like this, especially I think Mammoth, we check a lot of people's boxes. And so I've entertained, some serious consideration of things, and if nothing less, it's validated that, without proof of concept, like my idea, and not just mine, everyone in the community's idea, we're onto something. And that excites me, that there's already interest from people maybe to get involved before we have year one. And there's a bit of that temptation of like, oh, okay, like, yeah, we could just immediately have more resources if you do something, like if you sign on with someone. But there's a big part of me that wants to, for lack of a better phrase, like see how the sausage is made. Like I've never directed a race. I've never put on something like this. It excites me. There's that curiosity of like, oh, what's it going to feel like? How big of a lift is this? And through just the back end developmental stuff, I have a huge appreciation for all the events I've now gone to, especially the big European races where they're building like mini cities in certain areas. It's like, okay, like I can't imagine that because I'm just trying to, get this small little thing going, even though I have visions of it becoming very big. And so, yeah, and I also feel that I'm excited about the growth of our sport. Like Dylan and I have talked about this a lot. I think it's exciting for where it's headed. And I just hope that as a community, we continue to put our dollars and our time in things that we value, and because growth can be difficult, it can be challenging for any industry. Growth can hurt, but I think that if we have enough people with good intent and thoughtful purpose behind our growth, I think we're going to have an amazing sport in the next couple of years to a decade plus. And I hope to be part of that through this. And so if it was like, hey, let's just get rid of this event right away, not get rid, but let's, sign on with someone else. It's not that I don't trust it, but I feel like there's that potential for maybe losing the control of the vision you had to start out with too quickly.
I've made a note to return to that topic later in the conversation, the growth of the sport, good actors, keeping the vision. A couple more questions on the race directing front. Are you in this sort of race directing fraternity sorority now? Have you been talking with fellow race directors and getting ideas and advice?
I have. Not as much as I should. And that goes back to probably just something more personal. I've always struggled asking for help. It's kind of like, I have an idea, I'm going to go with it. And then you're almost too prideful to lean on other people because you have to admit that you don't know something. And that's been a difficult thing for me, when in reality, like, we all should be lifetime learners and leaning on those around us. But I've just had that insecurity of, oh no, I'm going to fake it till I make it kind of thing, and so, but I have reached out to Jamil, Craig Thornley, Jamil Curry, Avera Vipa, and Craig Thornley, Western States. I have another really close friend. Most people in the trail running world probably don't know him. JT Service. He is behind Soul Focus Sports. I've been running against and with him for almost 2 decades now. A super cool guy, and he's built an amazing company. But he was one of my early mentors when I was getting this off the ground. And we talked, and I was like, hey, it kind of feels like we're building the plane while we're flying, and there's that high risk of falling or failure, but that's what is exciting. And I think if it was a guaranteed success, it's probably you're not chasing the right goal. But so I've tried to lean on those people, but again, I should have leaned harder earlier because I dealt with a lot of just I'd say anxiety and fear around what I was doing, and because I wouldn't ask for help, it was worse than it needed to be.
This reminds me, I'm having the folks from Ultra sign up on the podcast in a couple of weeks, and it's going down the research rabbit hole. And apparently, you may already know this, but apparently they have a Slack group for race directors. So like every single RD that posts a race on their platform, apparently there's a whole community. I think that's kind of cool.
It is. And that's another, like, I saw that, I was like, oh, I don't need that. Like, I know what I'm doing. It's like, no, I don't know what I'm doing yet. But I have seen those little notifications because I'm hosting on their platform as well.
Right on. What made you want to be a race director?
I wouldn't say I necessarily want to be a race director, but I wanted to create something for our community, from our community, in a place that I love. And so I could even see this as it grows. I don't necessarily, well, I guess we could even like sidestep for a moment. Like, there's so many roles in an event like this. There's the permitting, there's the relationship building, there's the race directing, there's the course directing, there's, the list is long. And again, like, I can't do everything. So I don't know where my role eventually is kind of solidify. So in year one, I am kind of doing a little of everything, from just learning the website design and marketing, like everything I've just kind of fumbled through on my own, and that's been fun because I've always had this creative side that I would say became more dormant after I got into undergrad and graduate school, just because the medical field doesn't really promote that. But earlier on in my life, it was much more of kind of a creative outlet that drove a lot of the stuff I did. So I've just enjoyed that. And so it's more, I want to create something for people to experience trail running, because running has really changed my life. There have been a lot of struggles, but as a general theme, I think it's an amazing sport. I think it's something that everyone should have access to. And that's what's driven kind of my purpose, is I want to share this with people.
And you're going all in on this, right? You're going to be leaving behind. I mean, you're going to be doing, obviously you have like your contracts with Hoka from a running performance standpoint, but you're leaving the PT world to do this full time.
Correct. So at the moment I am per diem at our sports center, and which for the last decade I've been working in an outpatient orthopedic setting, working with, community members, recreational athletes, pro athletes, and so I'm stepping aside from that to really lean into this. And I think some of what I ultimately realized was, although that's a very fulfilling career, it also held a lot of anxiety for me personally, just because my identity as a runner got wrapped up pretty heavily in my identity as a PT, meaning that like I would get referrals from doctors or surgeons that say, only see Tim Tollefson. And like the amount of pressure I put on myself from that was pretty immense, and that would lead into a lot of other maladapted kind of responses in my personal life, where it wasn't that I didn't believe I could help someone, but suddenly I just had this immense unchecked pressure inside my head that if I don't fix this person today, where in reality you can't do that in PT, it takes it's going to take a while physiologically. I just had this, I really struggled with it, and then that didn't help my running career. Then I always had the side hustle of, I want to build this trail fest, and a lot of things were just at odds with one another, and ultimately I was burning myself out. Like, I was trying to work 3 full-time jobs essentially, and it's starting to feel as though I was dropping everything and not doing well at anything. And so, stepping away from the PT world, it's been a hard move, and it's been a multi-year kind of effort. But I feel like in the PT domain, I can make a huge impact on an individual, which, is very rewarding and powerful. But with something like this, I'm hoping I can have a greater reach. And I feel like, there are so many great therapists, both in my clinic, my colleagues, and like throughout the country. I just feel like I'm not tapping my potential by continuing just to dive down the PT world, kind of hole. I feel like there's something more out there for me, and this creative side, I think, is where, is definitely where I'm going to take my next crack at something. So
this is the perfect place to transition. We ask this question all the time on the show. In retrospect, do you think that working full-time as a PT was good or bad for your running career? And maybe this is 2 parts, but do you ever wish that you had experimented with running completely full-time?
So I guess my personal experience, if it was one or the other, it's mixed. I don't think I would have done better running full time in the sense of only having running. I know that I do better with balance. I don't think I've had balance in my life. So from that standpoint, if I hadn't been working full time as a PT, maybe my running career could have been better earlier on. But I think I still would have had to have filled my days with something. And this, I was introduced to this back in, and maybe I just have known too much, but some of my, one of my best friends and college teammates, he turned pro before his last year of eligibility at Chico, and he signed a multi-year deal with Adidas. He actually introduced me to Mammoth Lakes. I came on his recruiting trip with him. And then I, got to know him and his teammates at the Mammoth Track Club back in the day, which, were star-studded field of Olympians like Dina Castor and Meb and Ryan Hall and Sarah, Anna Willard, Pierce, all these amazing track athletes, Morgan Usney. And I got to know these people, and I realized, and as an up-and-coming, track athlete, people I really looked up to, and I witnessed multiple members of that team either struggle with only having running, and then mixed with losing contracts despite amazing seasons, making world championship teams, medaling at global events, and then losing contracts. So in my mind as a aspiring runner at the time is if these pros, true pros of the sport, can barely make it, or not barely, but they're on the chopping block, it built up this narrative in my head that someone like me that's just kind of a regional athlete is never going to make it. So then as I got into the trail world and actually had sponsors and was making it in the sense of I can make a living off this, I always had these seeds of fear that, if these legitimate pros in my mind couldn't maintain contracts, how could I? And so it really kind of scared me, where I always had to have my foot in another domain, and I always had to be planning for the future of, when these contracts are up, I have to have a fallback. And I think some of that led me from ever going all in a sense, but also it became a crutch where it's that race doesn't go well. I still have this. You kind of can almost settle on knowing that you have a fallback, if that makes sense.
You just reminded me, and I guess the question is it a worthwhile endeavor to create more stability for the pro athlete? And I'm always curious, why more brands, and maybe Hoka does this, but you sign an athlete like yourself, and then there's always this long-term plan where once your competitive days are over, there's a way to integrate you somehow into the marketing department, for example, so that at the very least, that when you're not running as fast as you used to, or you got injured and the results aren't coming, you have some place in the company no matter what. So there's stability, and there's less perverse incentives to do certain things during your athletic career.
Totally. And this is something that I've had conversations with many athletes and people in brands for a decade. And I'm sure it's a conversation a lot of people have, and we're starting to see a little bit more of that. Tracksmith has signed athletes that are also employees And I think it's really neat to start to see that a bit more, because for sure. And I mean, that's really, if you're thinking about a company, as athletes, we are basically in their marketing budget or in their departments. We have so much more to give than just a podium performance. Like, we're going to, depending on the sport, a marathoner might race twice a year. An ultra running, which is wild, we could be racing half a dozen to a dozen times a year, but still, it's a small percentage of, I feel like, the return on the investment a company could get if you were including them in different ways. Like, I mean, I have friends that were accountants, accounting majors, like in college. Like, why not have them mentor with your accounting department 10 hours a week or something? So you're building this kind of professionalism in their vocational domain. And I think that it serves athletes better, because I also know a lot of athletes that they ride the highest highs and then they're suddenly cut and they can't find a career path. And that's really sad. And I think that speaks to a larger systemic issue, even with collegiate sports. Like, how many D1 players in basketball and football really don't have much of a future set after, the final championship. And at least now with the name, image, likeness, hopefully they can make some money off of their talents in college. But I just think that there's a huge disconnect on how much we celebrate athletes, and then how there's not a post environment for them to thrive in. And I know there are some groups starting to work on, or they've been working on this. I'm not real familiar with it, but I think there needs to be more of that in every sport.
Do you think, and let's just imagine a world where athletes have that protective layer, like, they know that they're secure in their position, and when the career's over, they have some place in the company. Therefore, it does maybe make sense to go full time. Do you think that the performances in our sport at the top end would be better and the competition would be deeper if there were more athletes that went full time, like in the NBA and the MLB or the NFL? Or is running a unique sport where it doesn't need to be your one thing to get the best out of yourself?
Until recently, I would have said probably no, you don't need that. But as I've started to have, some of this is a time issue. I never had the time to even look into other sports, but I think that there would be probably more potential for top end, like, growth at a performance standpoint if we had that supportive network. And just using me as an N of one, yes. Like, if I had open conversations with team managers or brands, and they reassured me that, hey, like, it's okay if we skip this race, or it's okay to really focus on this next thing, I would have done things that are better for myself. But I, like, just recently, I've really looked into, like, Kobe Bryant. And ignorantly, I didn't understand how much he had things locked down. Like, and I'm just amazed by what he did with his career. And it's no surprise. Like, you don't stay, at the top, and you're not a GOAT for, most people wouldn't be there, accidentally. But, one thing, like, he talked about how when Phil showed up, like, he immediately introduced them to meditation and, like, mindful practices, in the early, like, probably 2000 or 99. And I'm just like, wow, what would have happened if I'd known what mindfulness or meditation was 20 years ago? Like, I think we all stumble upon those states, but accidentally, and you can't explain what you're experiencing, or you can't replicate it very well. So that, I was talking to a friend recently, it's like, throughout my career, collegiate, post-collegiate, or pro trail running, I've had so many times where I step on, I'm like, I hope this race goes well. You should never hope a race goes well. Like, you should know you're going to execute. You should know that you're going to get the best out of yourself. And I think those mindset shifts come from being educated, come from having resources, come from having a team around you, having, that education on, hey, this is what top end performance looks like. And, I went to a D2 school in college. We never talked about sports psych. I've never been, I still have never talked with a sports psych. But I know that a lot of the top programs in D1, if they have budgets, like, there's mandatory meetings for, like, athletes to meet with sports psychs. I feel like as a brand, if I was leading a company, like, and let's say I was in charge of Hoka and I had a stable of athletes, I would be linking them up with people that could help promote the top end of their sport. And personally, I've never experienced that. I've never asked for it. It's not that it wouldn't have been received. I didn't know what to ask for, but I think our sport could see better performances if we had that basically environment that cultivated, excellence.
You mentioned mindfulness and meditation there, which I think are excellent examples, because one of the questions I've always struggled with on behalf of pro athletes in our sport is there enough stuff to occupy your day that isn't physically taxing? Because running itself requires so much of you, whereas like Kobe Bryant, as a basketball example, he can go and shoot layups or free throws, and he could probably do that for hours on end in addition to the practice, and like that's not going to crush him. He can repeat that day after day. But running, even if you're going on like a recovery run, you're taxed. You're waiting like at least 10 to 12 hours to do it all over again. So mindfulness and meditation is good ones, but I'm always wondering like what else could you do to fill your day that would progress you but wouldn't tax you too much?
Yeah, I think there are probably there's stuff that could be done, because as you said, like, Kobe could practice like take 1,000 shots a day, and then in a game setting, like he's seen every potential scenario, so it's not a surprise. Like, it's so practiced. You can't do that in running, but I think there are a lot of those psychological things you could work on. Or I think that just getting involved with the company or having a part-time job, I think that is going to give you that balance. But I think the key there, and what I haven't had, is flexibility. It's kind of like, hey, let's get a 4-hour block of training in the morning, and then let's go do something for 2 to 4 hours, and then maybe do an evening session or some recovery. Like in a medical model, we're pretty, strict on like, hey, a patient's going to show up at 8:45. I have to be there at 8:45, whatever it is. And my job has been more flexible than a lot, but it's still not as much as I should have had to really be at my best, or to prioritize some of those other things. And then also, I mean, this is a much more systemic thing, but like a fear for me to make a move was also how in this country our insurance is tied to an employer. And in the last 2 years, it's the first time I've actually used my insurance by going to like therapy, more to work on, just psycho stuff. And like the thought of losing my insurance and not being able to access these services kept me in a role that it wasn't the best for me at the moment also, which is a wild kind of a, state to find yourself in. And so then it's like, well, there are a lot of people that stay in roles because of this fear of, okay, how am I going to get insurance? So I think that's something that is just unfortunate. Yeah.
That is such an excellent point about healthcare. Like one thing that, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but one thing that keeps me up at night is how many people in the world who should be doing something else are kept in a job simply because of like either the golden handcuffs or healthcare and fearing injury. It's insane. Like we could be unlocking so much creativity and passion projects. It blows my mind, and it's kind of sad.
It's really sad.
Okay, so we've talked about the career and sort of this healthcare safety net, and not necessarily implicating your own sponsors, but just talking about like the state of athlete brand relationships in general. Is there anything else that you would like to see improved, knowing that you've been in the sport now for like 8 years?
So early on in my career, I'd say like mentorship. I think that would be a huge thing. I would love to see NDAs go away, because I think that would give athletes a lot of power. In every contract we basically sign, there's an NDA where you're not allowed to speak about the specifics of a contract. And I think that historically that has allowed manufacturers a lot of power over an athlete, and athletes are contracted contractors, so they're not employees. They can't get insurance through the company. They don't like fall under the umbrella of any of those protections that an employee would have. And so I think that it'd be great to have some of that removed. I was fortunate that, living in Mammoth, I got to know some of these pro athletes that were in the marathon and track world. I reached out to Josh Cox, who is an agent for a lot of pro runners. And he is a friend. And so I used him as basically a mentor to like kind of ask about certain things and how contracts worked. And at that time, when I was looking to sign a deal, my pie was so small, it didn't make sense to have him as an agent. And so like he more did it just as a favor, like as a friend to kind of advise me. But that at least gave me some place, like, something to start with. And then as I've gone through my career, I've made a lot of mistakes in negotiations. But I've learned a lot, and it's kind of like, it'd be nice to be able to pay that forward to the next generation to hopefully make sure that they can, avoid some of the same pitfalls, and recognize that you don't have to just sign, for whatever they're offering the first time. It's a negotiation. But I think as athletes, or as runners, I should say, we come from a place of this, like, just feeling grateful for any opportunity. If someone's going to kick me some free gear, I'm like, oh, I'm so lucky. It's like, well, are you providing a service? Are you going to be, hopefully helping return on an investment from a company, like, and you're really, pushing the sport forward? Then you shouldn't just be signing for some free gear or some travel. You should be advocating for a lot more. But because you don't know what the market is, it's hard to ask. It's also very uncomfortable because you're talking about yourself. It can feel selfish or ego inflated, or you can feel like, I'm asking for too much. But in reality, it's a business decision, and that's where the power of an agent is there. I think would be helpful. They are experts in that. But then, depending on what kind of contract you're looking at, you'd be giving up a percentage of your potential earnings to an agent. And so I think the overall model, it's really set up not to be the best for a lot of young athletes. I mean, it's true for a lot of sports. But I think that would be a great thing to see lifted, or, at least adapted, or be a little more transparent with. I've had great relationships with my sponsors and negotiations, and they've always been very thoughtful and respectful. And I haven't gotten the sense, like, especially in the last 6 years, none of my sponsors have tried to exploit my services or pull fast ones, where earlier on in my career I experienced that a few times where I didn't understand legal jargon. And so now, like, I've been very thankful, especially, Hoka and some of these others, they've always done right by me. But personally, I still have a lot of anxiety over it because it's personal. I'm talking about myself with them. I'm trying to value myself. It's an uncomfortable state to be in. I feel that way. Where, to a company, it's just a line item. It's pretty clear cut, and, like, maybe you could ask for more, but I think they're just uncomfortable conversations to have. But I've learned to get better at it and learned to remove some of that attachment of kind of fear and I mean, that's true in any domain. Like, you could be in the tech world, you could be in the PT world, like performance reviews, all these types of things, they can be uncomfortable. But it's learned to manage those feelings throughout it. But I think historically it's like, and I won't use like trail running, but track running, like, we had this saying that you're just a replaceable billboard. Like, and everyone knows it. Like, you're going to have a good 2 to 4 year run, and then the next NCAA champ is going to come out and you're going to get replaced. And it was a sad state, but that was kind of the repeat. We saw that every couple of years in the track and field world, where it's like, you're just going to get replaced by a younger, faster version of yourself. And that's a hard place to be as an athlete, just knowing that it's a very short shelf life. And then also, if you don't know what you're asking for, or negotiations, like, you could really come out not very profitable.
I wonder how much longer the numbers around contracts are still going to be a black box, because, like, I was just watching SportsCenter earlier today, and on the ticker it was like, NBA player signs 4-year $20 million deal, or X player traded to Y team for X number of cash and a player to be named later. It's like, I wonder if that will ever become like a thing in anywhere in the running world. It's fascinating to think about.
Yeah, and I think with running, what's different is a lot of those, from my understanding, a lot of those teams, athletes are signing deals with teams, and those aren't under the same sort of restrictions as, like, we don't know how much LeBron is making from Nike necessarily. We know how much he's making from his team.
Yeah.
So there's kind of like, it gets a little more confusing, but there are a lot of sponsorships we don't know how much someone's making because they are under more of an NDA possibly. But in running, it's kind of like, since everyone's only dealing with like a company, it's all shadowed.
Since you've been in the sport, whatever it's been, 8 to 10 years, do you think that the number of pro athletes that have had the opportunity to do this full time has increased, or has it stagnated? Like, is it still like the same small number that can like not have a side gig, not have a side hustle?
I would guess that it has increased as there have been more companies that have come in. Like let's say just in the last couple of years, Adidas has made a big push. And they've done a lot of neat things with like trail running camps for their team, and they have increased their stable. So my thought would be that if you have companies like that, or now Brooks is coming in, Hoka made a big push a few years ago to really increase our stable. I feel like there probably is, probably not as large as we might think, because majority of athletes I would assume are more on that like kind of ambassador role where they have gear or maybe some performance bonuses. A lot of small companies, I'm sure, are barely giving anything in return for asking a lot of athletes. So I don't think it's I think there's a small percentage, but I would hope that it's more than a decade ago.
Let's transition to your racing career, because in my opinion, as a fan of the sport, you're still one of the very best. You're still at the height of your powers. You just ran the 4th fastest time ever at Way Too Cool. I want to talk about UTMB first, because I think you said in an interview maybe about a year ago today that your curiosity for that race had fizzled. And I'm curious if you still feel the same, because I know how important having curiosity for a race is to you, for you to care about it and show up and perform well.
The curiosity over that event, in terms of my, I'd say in terms of like what it might feel like to get around the mountain, that definitely has waned. And I think after 2 successful years in 2016 and 2017, there was a bit of that, okay, like I know what's possible in a sense, like I know that I can do it, and it wasn't as exciting of venturing into the unknown. And then that kind of piggybacked onto several years of like more just kind of really struggling internally with different stuff. And so there was no real interest in going back out there. But there felt like there was a lot of inertia behind me going back out there. And I'd say it's only been maybe the last 6 months as I've started to work on more of this, self-actualization, like realizing that, like there is a lot of hunger to still be out there and see what I'm capable of. I'm starting to re-peak that curiosity, where, and I think some of it also is back to like not needing UTMB anymore to validate something, like, to try and fill a self-worth issue, where it's more, I think I can go back there driven out of a sense of, okay, I want to see what I'm capable on the day, and not be afraid of failing. And I think that's where I could unlock that potential, where so much of my athletic career has been driven by other people's opinions, driven out of a sense of insecurity, or like, trying to validate like a worth issue. And when you're in that mindset, you really can't operate to your full potential, because you're constantly driven, I think, one, out of like not the best intent, but you're not able to be in the present moment. Like, you're so worried about what the future might hold through an accomplishment, or guilting over what the past has, like what has happened, and you're not able to be in that moment. And in running, that's the flow state. And I think anyone that has experienced flow knows how amazing that feeling and addictive that feeling can be, and how probably your best performances come out of that state. But it's a state that we can replicate with greater frequency, but you really need to get out of your own way to do that. And like you said earlier, you have to be present. You have to be mindful. And I didn't know what those meant. For a long time, I always thought like, that means like you got to do yoga, or it's like some woo woo thing. It's kind of like it was too meta for me. And I didn't realize that. Well, no, you don't get through any run without somehow finding the flow at some point, probably. Like, we just stumble into it. Anyone that's done that, I mean, for someone, it could be a 3-mile run. You might need to hit flow to get through 3 miles. But, for an ultra, you inadvertently stumble into those states. But again, not having no education in this, no real guidance. I didn't know what I was feeling, why I should have been focusing more on other things. So the mindset part was always missed. So a circuitous way of saying, yeah, I guess there's more curiosity now of, can I get back to UTMB and have a performance that's not driven out of anger or fear or insecurity? A lot of the different things that have driven my career, like what's possible. And I mean, I may find that the answer is, no, you ran better when it was out of anger, and that could be the truth. But I am more curious about hey, if I can line up to UTMB with a clear head, which I've never done, and what is possible. And so I guess that curiosity has reignited a fire to get back out there and try.
I've bookmarked a return to the mental side of the sport, talking about that later, because in my mind, there are some beautiful things and great performances that come from being unbalanced and, I'll say, driven by demons, but maybe it's not sustainable. So maybe we talk about that in a second.
Yes.
But I think you've also said that, you do know that you can win that race one day, and you do want to be on the podium again one day. Let's just assume that's still the case. Does it require dedicating a full season or calendar year to that race, or is this fabled Western States UTMB double actually possible for athletes?
History tells you that it's going to be a challenge. If we were looking at, well, I guess just because top of mind is popping out right now for men, like David Laney, he took 8th at States and then 3rd at UTMB. That was a really good double. I know for women, obviously, UTMB, there's been so much American success for women over there. Multiple, with Chrissy Mill, Courtney, Rory Bosio. I don't know if any of them had done states prior. I know a lot of them had done big races prior. Okay. Historically, we have seen that it seems that states and UTMB are so different. It's a hard double to do, and it is. I'm starting to realize that I think my limiting variable, and this is probably true for a lot of people, has never been the physical capacity. It's been my willingness to work through low moments, to be in a headspace to do that. And if I start to unpack it from that angle, I don't see a reason why someone couldn't do a UTMB states double. Now, there are a lot of things that go into that. You need to obviously be healthy coming out of both. You have to respect the recovery. But I guess that's a curiosity that drives me, that, hey, probably more so than just having a season geared towards a UTMB. Is it possible? And I think the answer is yes, but I think you also really need to be respectful of each moment in that process. Where, as I told Dylan, if it's not a go, and all outwardly signs are saying no, then you have to be strong enough not to try it. Otherwise, you're going to fail. And so I learned a lot from last year's, we'll call it it wasn't an attempt. It was an attempt. It was a poor attempt at both. But I learned a lot from that. And I think that it's something that I do think is doable. Because with a 100-mile race, so much can happen. I mean, you look at 2018 UTMB. That was probably the second most loaded field they had.
2017 being the first.
2017 being the first. And 2018, and they were so different. 2017, loaded, most competitive male 100-mile mountain race probably in our sports history. And I want to say almost nobody dropped out. Like, all of the favorites finished. In contrast, 2018, everybody dropped out. And people that normally wouldn't have made a podium or a top 10 were, which was a really neat thing. But that kind of highlights, you just don't know what's going to happen on the day. Like, Killian and Jim and I could all drop out this year. And Finn could win the race. It's you
take
just
a lot.
don't know you don't know what might happen. And so I think that variable of like the Cinderella story is always present, and you can't overlook that. But I'm going to stick with in this whole vein of, hey, let's try and be mindful and be present. My goal at the moment is Western States, and in the past because I've been so anxious about the future, like every little niggle that pops up, I think, oh, I'm injured. I'm not going to be able to race. If I can't race, then I can't validate something. If I can't validate something, then I'm not worth. You go down this like cascading thought pattern, and when that happens, you're unable to be in the moment. You're unable to be present, and even if your season ends up with a victory or a personal win, you can't reflect on that and you can't really have enjoyed it because you were never in the moment throughout the whole process, if that makes sense. And I've had that so many times in my career where I can't wait till that race is over because that's an opportunity to X, Y, or Z. And then I've lost 3 months of potential enjoyment of the actual act of running, spending time with Lindsay, spending time with friends, because I'm so worried about what the future holds. And then if it doesn't go well, then there's, that opens a whole nother side of things of guilting over what you could have done. And so you can end up in this cycle of not being able to enjoy that process and be growth oriented. And I have definitely found myself in that state a lot.
Assuming Western States is the focus this year, I think it is. What are you doing differently in this training block for Western States compared to 2021? Because I think you recently mentioned that the 2021 block was pretty solid. Like, I think you lived up to your famous quote of it's better to be 10% undertrained than 1% overtrained. Like, you were feeling pretty good. Like, is there anything you're going to do differently this block?
In terms of physical prep, I don't think so. Because I have definitely fallen victim to, okay, if 10 was good, 11's better. And that's not always the case in running. I think being consistent and replicating a proper block is more important, because it is. You got to show up healthy. And so I think really for me, the biggest thing that I could do for added success would be to continue to cultivate more my mindset going into it. And that's going to be the big focus over the next 3 months is lean deeper into that. Kind of like that analogy with Kobe earlier. It's like, I think he has said stuff like, I could take 1,000 shots, and then in the game you've seen like every single moment, so it's not a surprise. Like, it's just going to happen. It's automatic. Like, that's almost kind of what I feel like it could be worked on mentally. Like, practice a lot of different scenarios, good and bad, and be prepared for when those happen. And as we have also spoken on, inadvertently, I have worked through really deep lows in races and come out the other end with outwardly success, or with a successful performance. I don't know how I did that. Sometimes it's intuitive. Sometimes, maybe it's driven out of anger or grit, or you're just like trying to prove people wrong. But it does feel like it's luck, where I don't believe in luck. And I think that, the more I can work on these mental aspects, the more I can maybe repeat some of these things. And then I've kind of come to this realization that, in life, if you constantly, and this is personal, like personally speaking, like if you're constantly trying to numb uncomfortable feelings, then, and that could be through, I don't know, like people deal with things differently, but it's like, hey, like feelings are uncomfortable, and some people drown those through substance, some through actions, some through thoughts. But the goal is to basically like numb that and not feel what you're feeling. I feel like that can carry over into sport, where inherently running is hard. It's painful. It's difficult. And if you're constantly just practicing in a day-to-day life of numbing that, you get into sport and you start to try and numb that. Like, you numb that by backing off. You numb that by not continue to push. You numb that by dropping out. Where I listened to something with Courtney DeWalter recently, and I love her mindset of that pain cave. And, we hear the pain cave analogy thrown around a lot, but like for her, it seems that she's really, truly like has her chisel out and she's digging in and seeing how deep her pain cave can go. And she is sitting with that discomfort in a race and like almost looking for the discomfort, where I'd be more on the side of, I've always wanted runs to feel good. I wanted runs to feel perfect. I wanted them to feel effortless. Like, and the moment it starts getting hard, it's not that I always give up, but I'm not as, strong to push through that necessarily. And I'm more willing to waver on that. Like, oh, I want a reason to drop. Give me something, and I'd love to say as a pro athlete, I don't have that mindset or mentality, but that's what I have experienced. And so it's almost like, if we use her analogy, I'm like the foreman in the air conditioned, trailer up on top saying, oh, we can go deeper, but I don't have my chisel out and I'm not digging. She's in the depths of the cave digging and hammering. And like, because sport is something that, and running is something that I'm eager to continue to explore, I want to lean more into that. Like, I want to learn from her and other greats, like that mindset that they use, where, okay, like if we're, not having false sense of humility, it's like, I've had some good performances in my career. Like, so it's not to say I haven't had these moments, but again, it's like, I can't replicate why I did certain things. Like, and I think that for me, that mindset is what will dictate whether or not I can continue to. And so for states, I don't need to run more mileage. I don't need to have like more heat training. I don't need to put in bigger downhills. I need to cultivate the mind.
I've got one more question on the competition front, and then I promise we're going to mindset and psychology, because I think this is going to be an excellent conversation. There's just one question I've always wanted to ask you, and I'll first state my opinion. It seems to me that there are a lot of athletes in our sport that have what I call a false sense of humility. Like, they're afraid to say what they think they can do or what they'll accomplish. No one outwardly has any rivals or grudges, and the fan in me is like, that's no fun. So I'm curious why you think that is culturally in our sport, because you're somebody, at least recently, who's been pretty open about what you think you can do. Like, you've said you can win UTMB, you said you can win Western States. Do you think more athletes should follow suit as well?
It probably starts just from kind of a cultural difference, where a lot of athletes that get into running in general, it's a much more accepting and welcoming space where, you hear a common story of like, I wasn't that good on the soccer field, or I was good, but I was a better runner, like, or I didn't make the basketball team. And so then like no one gets cut from this, cross country. And so I don't know if it starts maybe some of those seeds, and it's a very just open and welcoming community, which I do love. I think that's an awesome aspect of our sport. I think, and I don't know where it comes from, but I think there is genuine humility amongst our community, but I think there is a tendency to lean heavier into downplaying your or like your intent or your goals. And as I'm learning more about kind of the sports psych side, I think that does potentially drive some people not to reach their best, because they're at odds internally. There's that internal struggle of like, I train to win, but I don't feel comfortable saying I want to win outwardly. And I think that can create some strife or some internal conflict. However, I look at someone like Claire Gallagher. I think she is a great example of excellence in our sport. She is an incredibly fierce competitor. She is driven. She is open about her goals. However, she's also empathetic towards her competition, and she knows when to turn it off. I think those are qualities that are important, because, there's a big difference between just being, an asshole and like being mean to people, and then actually just like being like, I want to crush these other women. Yeah. I think there's a balance there, and I love someone that's competitive, but I also love like someone like Claire. She's empathetic towards, like, she's going to win Western States, but also make sure her competitor is okay in the moment when she sees them like face down in a puddle. Like, it's not going to be like thriving off of this other person's demise. And I think that's something that I don't think you need to have the killer spirit in our sport necessarily. Now, I do think that you need to build up that mentality of like, hey, I'm going to, like, it's okay to outwardly say I'm going to win. It's okay. It's like Jim. Jim is very, I feel like he has a very clear intent on like, his mission in the sport is to win races, set course records, and light the world on fire. And I think that has allowed him probably to live up to his potential because he's not afraid to say it. Yeah. I've never been comfortable saying what I want to accomplish in the sport, and I'm not going to say that's why I have had spotty performances, but maybe in a thought experiment, maybe that is, like I wasn't willing, either not willing to own up to what I wanted, or I didn't even know what I wanted. I didn't have a clear intent or a why or a mission.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, let's talk about the mental side of the sport. I'm excited. And I know we've been hinting at this the whole conversation, but preface it by saying you have an excellent command of the English language. You have a couple great quotes I pulled up from previous interviews. The first being, quote, "The brain is a variable that can be depleted," and that you've approached many start lines exhausted and at war with yourself, and that these cracks in the armor are as significant as anything physical. So I'm curious, for you, have the signs been persistent throughout training blocks, or do they tend to appear towards the end when most of the work has been done? Because I'm curious, like when you judge that it's not time to, or it's time to pull the plug, and to not do a race because you're not ready to go to the well, you don't have the willingness to work through those low moments. I'm really curious what you think about that right now.
So personally, they have been kind of like they are present at all moments.
Okay.
And they may reach a crescendo right before a performance, and I think a lot of people will deal with this to some degree of like taper tantrums or kind of like not trusting everything they've done. But personally, a lot of, without getting really deep into this stuff, I've been driven in the sport of running for probably out of a lot of maladapted and insecure kind of drivers.
Yeah.
And when you're in training, it's easier to cope with some of those uncomfortable thoughts or feelings because you can just do more. You can just like you can double down on maybe some maladaptive strategies because you can basically just say like, well, I'm tired and I'm just going to do a little bit more today. Like, and that's okay because I'm not trying to compete yet. But once you start to get into the kind of the closer to a race, and if you're tapering in, like you need to be fresh, and you suddenly remove maybe some of these strategies that you use to cope with things, you've suddenly lost that pillar that's holding you up, and it can allow you then to go down. I guess you're losing your coping mechanism, and it's a hard world to navigate, knowing that then like the one thing you really want to do you can't do as heavily, and you can't rely on that, and I think that can then lead to a lot of internal conflict and even more doubt and insecurity. It's interesting. I've been in the sport of running for over 20 years.
Yeah.
And at different levels I've had success, but I still stand on start lines and can suffer from some of that imposter syndrome where, I'll look over and I'll see Finn and I'll just think, Finn looks like really fit today. Like, I don't know if I can beat you. Obviously that's not the Mamba mentality, or that's not, they're like, I'm going to light the world on fire, but it's something I'm working through. It's like, hey, be confident in yourself. Like, be honest and accept who you are. And I think that level of grace is hard to do, but it's, something we're working on.
First of all, I want to say, I really appreciate you being willing to talk about this, because I think when I think of vulnerability, and I'm not great at this myself, I have a ton to work on. I'm probably 2 or 3 years behind where you are, but when we limit depth in our lives, my understanding is we're putting a ceiling, a very low ceiling on so many relationships and opportunities in our life. So I think this is a great conversation. I know you also said that when you had that injury at UTMB in 2018, it was a blessing in disguise, because if you had podiumed that day, it might have delayed the work you're doing now to work on some of these thought patterns. And I'm curious if because of all the work you've done, are you less frequently internally battling with yourself these days? And is it having like an improved impact on your training?
Yeah, the frequency is being controlled a bit better. I'd say there's, like, every day, I find myself still having to choose to combat thoughts and, replace maybe a thought with something else. And I guess some of that is, learning that thoughts are automatic. You can't control your thoughts. And you can spend a lot of time trying to control your thoughts. And that just leads to more frustration and more, more struggle and pain, where you really have to reintroduce, maybe a competing thought with facts and reality, to challenge maybe where you are in your own head. And so learning to do that quicker, and also just being like gracious with myself, realizing that just having a thought isn't a bad thing. And that's normal, and thoughts are automatic. So I'm getting better at that, but it's, again, and maybe that's life. You're never going to conquer it. And I've had to let that go, where it's like, okay, it's a work in progress. Like, you're never going to get this perfect. It's going to be incomplete, but you can continue to cultivate and work on it and get more proficient at it.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the goal of working on it. And so it's improving. And I have noticed that has allowed in the last, couple months, some more enjoyable and thoughtful runs. Like before Way Too Cool, I had several runs where I finished and I actually enjoyed myself. And it's been a long time since that happened. And I think that's a testament to the path that I'm starting to find myself on. And it excites me then for, okay, maybe I can do more. And I mentioned to Dylan a little bit where, I came to the realization that maybe I don't have the appetite for suffering. I think that our sport requires a huge amount of discomfort to be successful on whichever metric you want to evaluate it. And for so many years, I was just suffering unnecessarily because maybe some of that internal struggle and kind of the battles that I was dealing with, where then on top of that, the running, you're never going to be present. You can't enjoy it, and it's really gonna suck. And so I feel like if you end up in a state where you're chasing things, maybe not, I won't say for the right reasons, but you have intent behind what you're doing and you're able to be a little more mindful with it, that suffering is much more of a gift, and it's a space that you can be thankful for versus it being suffering on top of internal struggle.
Yeah, and I thought you said something incredibly profound earlier, which is that if you're trying to numb uncomfortable feelings by default in life, it will carry over into sport. And the version in sport of numbing yourself is like either backing off your competitive abilities or even DNFing, which, by the way, I don't think is a bad thing, but like just not giving your best on the day or mentally giving in. I think that's a really interesting way to put it. And I had never really connected those dots. And, I've had some DNFs before, and I've definitely backed off in races because of those thought patterns in other areas of life. They definitely transferred over. So very interesting. I think you just gave the audience a lot to think about there.
And with that same, because there have been times, and I think there are a lot of people that may relate with this, we use running to numb our minds. Like sometimes I have almost felt like the only time I can get my mind to finally shut up is if I exhaust it so much through running. Yeah. But that also, as you said, like if you're a pro runner and all you did was run, you can only run so much. And then at some point you actually have to sit with yourself. Like you can't just be in motion all day long. But yeah.
I can't. Yeah. And just in a moment of my own vulnerability, I can't tell you how many times in an ultra I have quote unquote backed off because I was afraid to give my best effort, because I was afraid to show exactly what that was, which, for example, might not have translated into anything special, but it definitely was my best. So it's something very interesting to unpack.
And that concept, I think, is where if you have, you have another career here, or all these reasons why it didn't go well, you can always fall back on, A, B, and C, where if you actually gave your best, you have to accept that's what your best was. And I think that is a scary thing for all of us.
Very much so. Yeah. Man, excellent. Well, I mean, I could go forever, but for the sake of time, I know you and Lindsay have to boogie. Let's get to the miscellaneous section of this conversation. And the first one I have for you is, what is something you used to believe strongly about running? It could be any area of running that you've recently changed your mind about.
That running is a good form of therapy. I think that it's a wonderful coping strategy, but until it isn't. And it shouldn't be a replacement for any sort of true therapeutic need.
If you could pick any historical runner from any running discipline to see the Strava logs for, if the platform had existed at that time, who would it be and why?
Oof. I don't know.
Everyone says pre, but I mean...
I know. And I mean, the teenage boy in me would say the same thing. I mean, I would be interested in Ann Trayson's training logs. Yeah.
What's a recent book, movie, or podcast you've consumed that has left a big impression on you, and why?
So I've just recently gotten into audiobooks, and there's one that has been kind of like my little personal Bible. It has veins of self-helpiness, but Wabi Sabi by Beth Kempton is it was a really great listen. And then if you're like just a classic, like in the endurance world, Endure is a really in-depth but great listen.
Is that Shackleton?
What was that?
Endure, is that about Shackleton?
So they talk about him.
Okay.
Yep.
Last question. If you could put a message on a billboard for all to see, what would it say and why?
Ask for help.
Perfect place to put a pin in it. Tim, I can't thank you enough for your time. Excited to follow the rest of your journey to Western States. We'll definitely plug the new race in the show notes, as well as all your social media handles. Before we go, is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
Not that I can think of. I would just, I guess, reach out to people. As I'm learning, the more I talk about things myself, the more some of the power is stripped away in my head, and how less isolating, lonely, and sad things can feel, because you realize it's a part of the human condition. Suffering is part of that, and a lot of people will have similar shared experiences, and I think it's nice it's comforting to know that you're not alone in those thoughts, because it can feel like you're the only person in the history of the world that's ever had that thought, and then in reality it's like, no, everyone to some degree has probably thought that, others more so, but I think it's just talk to those that you care about.
Amen. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Finn.